This is the first edition of the Social Innovation Think Tank. What we hope to do is that each month we're going to look at social innovation and its impact on global issues. And we're going to be talking to change makers. Now, those change makers could be practitioners, or it could be academic colleagues who are studying practitioners, or even those who are doing both at the same time. It does happen. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk to a number of our graduates, graduates who've been through our 2-year program. And at the Centre for Social Innovation, we do 3 things. One is we do research, as you might expect. We cover things like community organising at a grassroots level. We're looking at things like gender and the mafia, work on the history of social innovation, and all the work our students do with us in their research projects. We have the Masters, as I mentioned, and we also have Cambridge Social Ventures, which is our incubator based in Cambridge, which draws in people for our social venture weekends, and also then takes 15 ventures in incubation between 6 and 12 months. So that's the centre. So one very important part of the centre is our part-time masters, aimed at working professionals, people all ages from 23 into the mid to late 60s. You know, some who are very accomplished in different fields, a really eclectic mix of people who come together to think about, to worry about, to ponder issues around social change and social innovation. And if you want to find out more, check out our Facebook, check out our web pages, and also look at our YouTube channel for more information and content. So, Paul, if you could introduce our participants, please.
So we've got 4 graduates that we're going to chat to about the programme and their experience in the programme. 3 of those graduates were in cohort 1, the pioneers, so they had taken the course before we'd even written the course. So they had applied for the course before we'd even written the course, so these are very brave people. And let me introduce them one by one. We've got Jessica Rose, and Jess works for a Spanish cancer charity as a fundraiser. We've got Patricia Odero, who works in global healthcare as a medical doctor by background. We've got Nick Milner, who has a marketing company and is a scientist by background. And we've got Simon Dwight, who is the CEO of a homelessness charity. So maybe if I can just start off by asking you about your motivation for applying for the programme and how that influenced your thinking about social innovation. Jess, can I start with you?
Yeah, sure. So I am a fundraiser by background, as Paul said, and I've been working in the philanthropic sector. I had been working in the philanthropic sector for about 15 years. I was really interested in doing a master's program because I had been doing my job for a long time and I was just looking for a bit of an additional intellectual stimulation. I looked at lots of different master's programs in different places and none of them felt quite right. I definitely didn't want to do an MBA. And then when I found the Masters in Social Innovation, I was extremely excited because it just ticked all of my boxes. One of the things that I had found quite frustrating in my job, and I have worked across the charity sector in government and higher education, was that I felt like there was a lack of strategic alignment between those 3 sectors. And I really believed that there was a way that the charity and the higher education sector could work better, in particular with the corporate sector, to start solving some supposedly intractable social problems. One of the things that I felt really wasn't working was the way that lots of funders fund all sorts of different charities with small amounts. And even though it makes everybody feel good, it's not actually making a lasting change. I was finding that extremely frustrating, and I felt like this course might help me get a better understanding of why that was happening and what could be done. And it absolutely did. It absolutely did do that. And so not only did it help me to start thinking in a different way and meet a network and a cohort of amazing people that then also became my friends and colleagues on future projects. But I ended up doing my dissertation on the fundraising sector. I chose the fairly gritty topic of how fundraisers manage sexual harassment from donors. And to my surprise, it hadn't ever really been studied before, and it absolutely hit a chord with people all over the world, frankly, which has led to a number of, and I'll probably talk about this a bit later on in the session, but it's led to some real changes starting to happen in the sector, which is more than I ever could have dreamed from starting this master's. So that was my motivation, and it was absolutely worth it.
Thank you very much, Jess. Patricia?
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, so as you mentioned, I started out my career as a doctor, did do an MBA somewhere early on in order to be able to pivot into development advisory. And by the time I was applying for the course, I had been working for Duke University's Global Health Innovation Center for about a year. And I think what led me to that space of working around innovation was really just the idea that, you know, there have to be new ways of doing things that could be able to solve for some of what seem to be almost intractable challenges in the healthcare field. So our team essentially supports entrepreneurs that are looking to scale their ventures, but also works with ecosystems or, you know, stakeholders that then need to embed those innovations within their, you know, daily way of doing things. And when I came to the course, I really didn't have language to express the benefit of what we were trying to do. And also just trying to understand, you know, the impact of this on other sectors outside of healthcare. And so, you know, I came into the course and, you know, Neil and Paul had published a paper on, you know, ways of organizing social innovation that gave me the actual term for what I was doing, which was I was an extrapreneur, which is as opposed to an entrepreneur where I had not started a venture, or an intrapreneur where I was making change within an organizational setting. And so that was really powerful for me. But then also being able to think about aspects such as wicked problems and how interrelated some of the things that we were trying to solve in healthcare are with other sectors. And just the benefit of being able to interact with, you know, colleagues and fellow students who are working in some of those sectors, some of which are quite adjacent to healthcare and others which maybe seem farther off, but have, you know, the same sort of social purpose. And eventually, I think that led me to doing my dissertation on a topic that's very different from what I do on a day-to-day basis, which was really looking at crowdfunding in Kenya and the growth of crowdfunding. You know, how do you take an alternative finance instrument, something that's sort of on the fringes in other markets, but is a very viable way of funding social ventures in my context, Kenya, and how do you examine how that is growing organically, and what are some of the foundational aspects, such as trust, that are needed to grow that? And so this, I think, this course really, I mean, broadened my mind and helped me, you know, think through, you know, new ways of organizing my thoughts. And I'll maybe just touch on that a bit later.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Patricia. Nick?
So I started my career, so I did a PhD and then I went into industry as a research scientist and then moved into the business side. And after 25 years, I started a business consultancy and had the misfortune of having to take that through the banking crisis in 2009 and 2010. And it was there that I realized how interconnected society and business and citizens really are. So it got me thinking about different business models and the interconnectedness of society. I'd covered things like the balanced scorecard and corporate social responsibility and, you know, philanthropy before, but I hadn't really got a sort of worldview of all of that. And when I found out about social innovation, that really pricked my curiosity. And I was looking for something that was structured rather, you know, I was reading widely, but it's not the same as doing something which is structured and organized. And so I applied and got onto the program and wondered what it was going to be like. And the first thing we did was we covered wicked problems. And when we started to look into wicked problems, I realized why I was struggling to find solutions for certain business or semi-business and societal problems. Of the things about the course that I got out of it straight away was, I think that you do meet a tremendous range of very gifted and diverse people. Your fellow students will all be special people. You know, people don't accidentally turn up and do this program, especially amongst the pioneers. But also, we did some very specific things that were fascinating. Doing different business models, the number of different ways that a social enterprise can organize itself. That was fascinating. The requirement to write a business plan, start to finish, in double quick time was really motivating. And then the dissertation at the end was a really great opportunity to pick a subject area. And I looked at decision making and the differences between social entrepreneurs and for-profit entrepreneurs, and that's generated some very interesting findings. So all in all, it's been a great experience start to finish. And I just wanted to say, I arrived in my late 50s, and you do need to make space in your life to fit in a master's degree for 2 years. Maybe we could talk about that a bit later, but it is very possible, certainly at my stage of career, and it's energized me to look more widely and think more widely and provide advice more widely than I did before I started the program.
Thank you very much, Nick. And Simon?
Hello. Yes, I was 10 years ago. I was a support worker for the homeless charity that I now run, and I worked my way. I was a support worker in the high support hostel and worked there for a little while. And I worked my way through the organisation and became CEO 7 or 8 years ago. And we grew very rapidly after that. And we were suddenly working with a lot more homeless people. We were responding to kind of needs that we saw, and part of that was responding to the refugee crisis. And generally, it was going really well. But a lot of it, I wasn't really sure how we were doing it. we were just stumbling across things that kind of worked and finding our way through. And so I don't have kind of a background in running organisations or anything like that. So I was looking for something that would help me to understand how we'd done what we'd done. And also I was really keen to kind of expand that into the next level, to be able to show everybody what we'd managed to stumble across and to try and influence others, and just I wanted to get a bigger perspective on everything that was happening out in the world and understand how to help vulnerable people more effectively. That was my motivation, I suppose. I applied to Cambridge, and I had looked at a few other bits and bobs. So I didn't expect to get into Cambridge. It didn't seem like the kind of place that I would be able to get into. I was just, I can't speak highly enough of both the course, but I think the thing that struck me straight away and still stays with me today is that it's a community that you become part of. Across the kind of cohorts and just it's the course, but it's also beyond the course, and it's really opened up my mind to all the other people in all kinds of different sectors and parts of the world that are doing amazing things, and just the willingness of everyone to kind of muck in and help each other out and learn from each other was brilliant. And I ended up doing my dissertation kind of really in my own wheelhouse. I wanted to understand how homeless people made sense of interventions that were trying to help them. I wanted to understand the impact we were having, really, and how we could improve. And so, you know, that research was a great experience. I loved it, but it's also really changed the way I think about the services that I run, and hopefully is influencing into how other services run them as well.
Thank you very much, Simon. So I think you've all given us a really good sense of your motivation for why you wanted to apply to the program and study in the program. I want to talk a little bit about your experiences of the program, what it's like to be a student on the program, because obviously you're very busy people. You've got high pressure jobs, you're juggling lots of things, family commitments as well. And one of the things that prospective students often ask us is, you know, is this feasible? Is this possible? What's it like to do part-time study over 2 years as well as manage these other things? So maybe I could ask you next about your experience of that and how you found it. Jess, if I could maybe start with you.
Yeah, sure. So I was in the situation that when the course started, and you start with an online module of reading and some work before coming together for the first week-long residential. When the online module started, I had a 4-week-old baby, and it was our first child. So it felt a bit nerve-wracking to be starting a master's at Cambridge, of all places, and also embarking on motherhood. But actually it was fine, because the nature of the course means that you can do it in your own time and consume the material at your own pace. And in some ways, for me, being on maternity leave, I possibly had some more flexibility during the day than others. Where it became slightly more challenging was when I returned back to work into a full-time job, and I was managing a large team at the University of Cambridge at the time, managing staff, and doing a master's, and had a toddler. That's where I needed a little bit more of a community around me to help with certain things. Not so much doing the modules, but obviously for the residentials. And then while I was doing the dissertation, I needed a bit of time and space as well. So I relied on help from my husband and from people helping to babysit, etc. But for me, because I was so interested in the topic, I was having to do a lot of the readings and things at night, but it wasn't too arduous because I really, really enjoyed the content. And I know that might sound funny, but I have done other study in the past where you're just trying to plow through the material. But particularly for me, I loved all of the readings I was doing. I found it really fascinating. And so it is a time commitment, but I would say that if you're loving the content, then it was, for me, I actually enjoyed doing the work for the bulk of the time. While I was writing the dissertation, what actually was the way that I managed it, having a small child and having a full-time job, was I actually took some annual leave from work, and so I was able to take the time and space without having to worry about work, and while my little boy was safely in childcare, to get a lot of my dissertation done. Everybody does it differently, but it absolutely is achievable.
Thank you very much, Jess. Patricia?
Yeah, so very sort of similar circumstances as Jess. I met her little boy when I was 35 weeks pregnant, which is when I attended the first module. And so I think just that balance of, a very different set of family circumstances, starting a program, and then, continuing with work. It's definitely, I think, challenges you. And I did feel very stretched, I think, for the first couple of modules. But then after that, I think you get a rhythm, and then you figure out, how do you, make sure that all the balls are in the air, at least the ones that need to be in the air. And, what do you put aside? So it's definitely a few choices. My social life, so at some points took a back seat. But then I think just, very similar to what Jess said, the fact that I was so, this was so applicable to what I was doing on a day-to-day basis. It was really, really interesting, not just intellectually, but also in a very practical way. I think for me, motivated me to, put in that extra time, whether it's nights, weekends, and also sort of balance, with a bit of a hectic travel schedule, because I travel about maybe 25 to 30% of my life pre-COVID. And so, just how to fit all that in. I think the dissertation writing, first getting doing the research was, I had to take annual leave. But then the dissertation writing was, I think probably maybe the most challenging. And apart from, of course, just getting support from my cohort, just making sure that, you're there'll be people who'll be ahead, there'll be people who'll be where you are, just sort of feeding off that energy. But I think also just the program team and their support, to just help me keep on track. I think that was really, really helpful. And, it took a village. Like I shared probably at the conference in January that I had friends who volunteered to help me transcribe some of my interviews, other friends who had no idea about social innovation, but were so, caught up in my enthusiasm that they offered to read, drafts of my paper. I think it definitely takes a village. And so even as you think through this, I think for, any prospective students, you can think about it. Some of the things you can plan around, others, well, life happens and you will adjust. But I think it's something very, very doable and worth the pain and the investment. Did I say pain?
Thank you very much. Now, Nick, I don't think you're a baby, at least not as far as I know, but I'm sure you had other challenges balancing various things.
Well, I started with 3 grown-up children and I finished with 3 grown-up children. I think getting through it, the first thing is to make sure that your spouse or partner knows that you're going to do it and is fully supportive, because it does take up a huge amount of your non-working time. And so I talked to my wife about it at length, and a bit like Simon, I applied not knowing if I was going to get on or not. So I just thought, well, I'll cross that bridge if they offer me a place. And so when I got a place, I decided that the way to do it was, I don't know what the guidance is on the number of hours, but I decided I'd need to split up that time. So I planned to work 3 or 4 evenings a week, a couple of hours. But like Jess, I got very, very interested in it and did a lot of the background reading because I was enjoying it so much. So I ended up working 3 or 4 evenings a week. So I get home from work, eat something, and then maybe start work about 7:30 and work for 2 or 3 hours. But it was engaging. It wasn't a chore. I was doing it because I wanted to. And then at the weekend, I'll give another day or a couple of mornings. And that way, I managed to stay up on the pace because the modules are done on 2 weekly turnovers. So when you see what there is to do, and you can kind of chunk it up into your head into the amount of time that you've got. I mean, you can't always work out how long it's going to take to read everything, but to do the many assignments or inputs you have to make. The first one was a bit of an exploration, but I'd say as the time went on, I got better and better at it. That time doesn't come from nowhere, and the things that I decided that I wouldn't do, I wasn't going to say, I can't do that because I'm doing the master's course. I decided I was going to massively cut down on the amount of television I was watching. I decided to stop reading newspapers, and I stopped reading for pleasure. When I was reading papers and coursework, and that made enough space. I mean, it's amazing how much television I was watching. So it's very doable, but you do. And then another thing was I had to I got my, Patricia said it takes a village. It took my friendship group, and I just said to them, look, I'm not being antisocial, but I'm not coming out on Friday night because or Saturday night because I've really got a big session on my coursework to do. So there's that about it, but there is a rhythm to it. There's 8 weeks, then there's that sort of revision week, then there's an intensive week at Cambridge, and then you've got your work, then you do your work, and then you get a week off, and then you start all over again. And so it takes time. So do it. If you're doing it because you really want to do it, it will be like, well, I'm not going to say it's like nothing else you've ever done, because I don't know what else you've done, but it's a really fantastic and special and immersive experience where you meet great people, but you're signing up something which is difficult. And I think I've said this before when I was asked, this is Cambridge. It's going to be hard, but it is very doable, and it's excellent as well.
Thank you very much, Nick. Simon?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo the thoughts of the others, really. I think I've got a young family, so they're 7 and 9 now, and I finished last June, so you can do the maths. But yeah, so it has to be a joint decision, which I think is what everyone said, really. It's not just me that was affected by doing it, but also my wife, kids, work, friends. And I think having the buy-in, particularly of my wife, was, I mean, I couldn't have done it otherwise. And similarly to what other people have said, I think it's just really important to be disciplined about it. And if you start to fall behind, I think that's when people in the cohort struggled a bit. And I think being disciplined about setting time aside to do it, it can be done. And it's challenging, but it can be done. And also what others have said about how interesting the reading is, it is, I would spend some evenings reading the material, but it didn't really feel like I was doing something terrible and working. It felt like something that was, it felt like something I was enjoying. So it didn't feel like too arduous, really. And then I think there are points where it really, the modules really focus on to what I was actually doing in real life, So it felt very directly applicable to my work life. So there was a real kind of synergy, I suppose, with what I was learning and what I was able to apply. So I think it felt easier because of that. It all felt applicable and interesting. So yeah.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a pause. And in the second part of this think tank, we're going to move away from the motivations and the practicalities of the course to some of the ideas and challenges of the course. So join us for part 2 soon, etc. So in part 2, we're going to move on to about some of the ideas, some of the challenges, intellectual challenges of the course, and what the graduates felt and got out of the challenge we put to them. Okay, Paul.
Okay, thank you, Neil. So this is obviously a course for practitioners rooted in practice, but it's also kind of a hybrid course in a way, because we also push people quite hard theoretically, and we cover a broad range of different theoretical ideas to try and uncover what social innovation is, what social problems are, and different solutions and so on. I'd just like to ask you a little bit about what were the kind of key ideas or most compelling or interesting ideas that we covered on the course from your standpoint, and what were some of the challenges that you had in engaging with those? And maybe, Nick, if I could start by asking you that question first.
Yes, it's having done a master's in management earlier in my career. There's a lot of stuff when you're learning about business, but you're learning how to do things, not necessarily about the nature of things. And I would say this program is theoretically very heavy. the opening parts of the course were theoretical areas I'd never come across. I'd not studied any social science, so I'd never come across things like conflict theory. And I found that really interesting. So for someone that spent more than 30 years in the private sector, I ended up reading the Communist Manifesto as part of a piece of coursework that I was writing on conflict theory. So it really does draw you into a much more intellectually expansive area. But all the way through, it was theory strong. We were being asked for the theoretical background to the material that we were discussing. And in the end, when I came to my dissertation, I explored an area of behavioral economics called prospect theory. And I used prospect theory as a way of exploring differences in the thought process and decision making when giving the same business problem to social and for-profit entrepreneurs. So I'd say that, and as a result, the whole experience of the master's program was that it made me think about my job in much more theoretical and abstract terms. And also, I would say probably one of the big takeaways was to problematize the question. So there's no such thing anymore in my head as a question. That question needs to be unpacked to really understand what's behind it, why is it being asked, what's the context of that question, before just saying the answer to the question is. And I would say that discipline, that training is widely applicable, and I use it now all the time.
Thank you. Simon, what about you? How did you find the theoretical ideas that we covered in the program?
It was a steep curve for me, I'd say. Particularly that first module was quite heavy theory and something that was a steep curve. But I think it introduced you to so many different theories, and then the ability to be able to kind of focus into one that kind of really resonates with you. And for me, that was sense making. And then I found that was just something that I was able to. It seemed to make a lot of sense to me and help me. There's a module where you kind of reflect on change, and using that sense-making theory to kind of reflect on a change that I'd made in our organisation was something that really opened up my eyes to the effectiveness of applying theory, I suppose, in a way I'd not thought of before, but in a way that challenges you to step back from your own perspective and to analyse it through a different way. And so I'd say it's a steep learning curve when you kind of get introduced at the start to all these different theories, but then it seemed to me that there was just one or two that really started to resonate and started to make sense, and then you kind of dig deeper, and there's enough flex in the course, I think, to dig deeper and deeper into those theories. And then that was one of the main theories I used for my dissertation, and just a way of thinking. And I think it even comes into my language in an everyday way now when I'm talking to people that I work with. It's like, how do people make sense of that? For me, that was a theory that resonated. And you're introduced to lots, but then I think you find ones that particularly resonate and then make sense to you.
Thank you, Simon. What about you, Patricia? What theoretical ideas did you find most compelling?
Well, maybe before I say the theoretical ideas, I think I wanted to touch on something. We've been talking about like the heavy theory, and it's very abstract. But essentially, I think there's a tension between theory and practice, that essentially you explain the practical world, like what we as practitioners seem almost, I guess, innate, and actually understand this through theoretical constructs. And so for me, this was around really looking at our institutional work and at the dimensions around
We've lost Patricia for a second. Perhaps we'll move on to Jess while Patricia's sorting out childcare, I think.
The joys of us all doing this in isolation, isn't it? Yes, for me, well, like some of the others, I mean, I studied a business degree as part of my undergraduate many years before, and it had been in many ways a very practical degree. And so this was the first time that I had really done academic study at this level. And like Simon said, it was a steep learning curve at the start, but I actually really enjoyed it. And that was exactly why I did the Masters in the first place, because I wanted my mind to be challenged in a different way. And it made me, I mean, it was just, I found the learning process interesting to start with. But secondly, I was amazed at how much of the theory I was able to apply to my life, be it my work life and my personal life too. So a lot of the theories that the others have mentioned already were really interesting for me in my professional life. So learning about sense making also really resonated. We looked at transformational leadership. All the stuff about wicked problems was absolutely fascinating. And then there were some other things that just made me think in a different way about other aspects of my life. So one of the earlier assignments I wrote about the social construct of gender. And it's not anything that I had actually, done a lot of academic reading into gender as a social construct. And the more I looked into it, the more fascinating it became. And I thought, why have I never engaged with this in the past? It not only made me think about my interactions at work and actually played a part in helping me decide what I was going to do my dissertation on, but I started thinking about all sorts of other things, like how I was raising my son. And so for me, I found the theory, some of it was challenging and really difficult to get my head around. But I liked the way that pushed me to think about other things. And then it also, I just became much more comfortable with being able to search and look for things myself. So we had all the set readings and you had to do them. But then I would go into Google Scholar and start looking up other things and finding other articles, and it would lead me down a bit of a rabbit hole of theory. But it just trained me to think in a different way. And happily, I have maintained that despite having finished the Masters. So now when I'm interested in an area, I actually will go and have a look, at a couple of articles and I'm thinking about things in a more academic and a more scientific way, which I'd never really done in the past. And I think that's another benefit of this being a 2-year part-time Masters. If we had crammed it all into 9 months, I think it would have been, we wouldn't have been able to come up for air. Whereas doing it over 2 years, you get into a rhythm and a pattern of looking at things in a different way, in terms of with intellectual rigor and having to write the assignments and all the referencing and that kind of thing. And it really has changed the way I approach my work and I approach my parenting and I approach my personal life. And so for me, that was really interesting. And one of the things that probably stood out the most was the theories around leadership and around interactions between colleagues and the way businesses run effectively and that kind of thing. I found that really useful and interesting.
So, Patricia, you were halfway through.
Yes,
I think you're telling us about the challenge of practice and theory. Yeah.
Yes, then a cranky toddler came and interrupted my flow. Yes, so I was saying that I think that tension between theory and practice, that I think a lot of the times, those of us who come from, and I think a lot of prospective students will probably come from being practitioners, you, in a sense, feel your way through and you know this is innate, this is how things happen in either my sector or in my field. But then I think taking a step back and, deconstructing it and abstracting it, helps you sort of understand, opens this black box, but helps you understand, like, practically, how are you growing, for example, a new innovation, or supporting an ecosystem, and then therefore how can this be replicable? So for me, just thinking about my dissertation was on crowdfunding. So in the Kenyan context, we actually crowdfund, as in it's in our culture. We do donations through Harambee. And so that's something that was very cultural. But then also now looking at this crowdfunding as an alternative finance instrument and trying to understand, so how is this happening? How is this growing, in this space? And what are the challenges in a space where culturally, like, this is something innate? I think so then beginning to think through this through the lens of institutional work, social capital, trust, and how those are fundamental to be able to grow any emerging field. I think for me, really helped me look at this, something that's very sort of social, I've been socialized in through a very different way. And I think that has allowed me to then now come away with, just being more curious, not just accepting that, this is how things go, but then really understanding, what are the underpinnings, and therefore then what is replicable, and also what are some of the challenges and the questions, based on what Nick said, that need to be answered. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So a really important part of the program is the research component. So the whole of the second year is based on a research project, and of course you have methods training as part of that. And the four of you did a very different type of dissertation, very diverse range of topics. So we just want to ask you a little bit about your dissertations, and if you could maybe briefly say what your research question was and what you discovered. And maybe if I can start with Jess, first of all.
Yeah, sure. So as I said before, I was looking into how fundraisers manage sexual harassment from donors, which was a very, very sensitive topic. Because I'm a fundraiser myself, it was a really interesting process because I essentially was doing peer-to-peer research, which meant that my respondents, who were all either fundraisers or managers of fundraisers, were very open with me, which was a real positive in talking about this issue of sexual harassment from donors. I started writing about this just before the Me Too movement actually happened, and so it ended up being very timely. And I interviewed fundraisers and managers from all around the world, and I wasn't asking the question, do donors sexually harass fundraisers? Because we know that they do. I mean, every fundraiser I've talked to has had personal experience of this. What I was really interested in looking at was how do fundraisers and their charitable organisations manage it and handle it. What was really, really fascinating for me that came out of the research was that most fundraisers tolerate it because they don't want to endanger the gift at all, and organisations tolerate it at all as well for the same reason. They're very willing to remove that particular fundraiser from harm, but in a very non-confrontational way. So at no point do they wish to confront or upset the donor because they don't want to risk the donation. And for some reason, that was a surprise to me and to other people that I was interviewing, the reluctance to do anything about changing the discourse, which is, it's part of the job. And the thing is, many fundraisers, not all, but many fundraisers are women. The great bulk of big donors are wealthy and white and older men. And there's just this entrenched discourse in the industry that is it's par for the course. And what really came out of it was the whole issue is to do with power and the imbalance of power, the current imbalance of power between a donor and a charitable organisation, or a donor and a fundraiser. So it was fascinating. It was at times disturbing. It also So once the results came out and I started talking to some charitable institutions and fundraising regulators about it, there is a bit of an appetite for change, to my relief. And so as a result of doing the dissertation, I've actually started doing more work in this area outside of my job, but presenting at some conferences and working with some organisations around the world about how we can change this. And to my great surprise, I actually have decided that I would like to continue the original research. And I've actually just recently applied to do a PhD in a similar area. And I say my great surprise because I really hadn't done any kind of academic study in years and years, and probably 15 years. And writing the first essay was like pulling teeth. I mean, I found it really, really challenging. But then over the 2 years of the master's, you do get more used to reading and writing in a particular way. And then I really loved the research. I found it really fascinating, to the point where I want to continue on with it. So for me, it's been a sort of an absolutely transformative process, personally, but it's ended up doing exactly what I wanted to do by doing this master's, which was actually enact change in my industry in an area that I was finding really frustrating. So I couldn't have asked for more.
Thanks, Jess. Now, Nick, your dissertation was not tightly connected to your work in the way that Jess's was, but maybe you could tell us a little bit about your question and what you found. You need to unmute yourself first, though.
There we go. So the title of my dissertation was Mission and Money, a Social Prospect Theory Analysis. So there's a constant tension in all social enterprises between ensuring that the mission is delivered, that's to say the objectives to provide service, look after needy beneficiaries and so on, and at the same time to remain solvent, to be able to fight another day. So all the time they may need to make changes because they can't afford to do things, or refuse to accept that there's not enough money, push on, and then hope that the money turns up later. So there's constant tension between mission and money. Now, prospect theory is one of the cornerstones of behavioral economics, and it really goes against the last 300 years of economic theory. Economic theory says that people always behave with their own selfish best interest in mind once they're given all the information that's relevant. But we know that that's not the case. People often behave not in their own self-interest, as we see with charity and altruism. But we also behave in a completely biased way when we look at risk. And so how can you apply prospect theory to the decisions that both for-profit and social entrepreneurs have to make every day when they're running an enterprise? Collected data from just under 50 for-profit and social entrepreneurs in 2 balanced groups, and I asked them some standard prospect theory questions, which test their appetite for risk or risk-taking ability, and they behaved entirely in line with previous prospect theory analysis, prospect theory studies. When I asked them questions about social enterprises, so I asked both the for-profit and the social entrepreneurs to adjudicate on 4 social enterprise business problems, I thought that prospect theory might explain that they would be more risk-taking when the businesses or the organizations were in trouble and risk-averse when there's a certain gain. But that's not what happened. In all cases, when there were needy individuals or beneficiaries who were at risk, so both groups, the for-profit and the social entrepreneurs, behaved in a very defensive way to ensure that the mission to deliver the social benefit was protected for the longest period of time. Now, it was the first time as far as we know, that behavioral economics and prospect theory has ever been applied to social enterprise. And the findings were counterintuitive until we really dug into them. I found it fascinating. As you can probably hear, after 2 years, I'm still talking about it like I finished it last week. And Paul and I, along with another professor in one of the other departments in the business school and a PhD student, have continued to explore what this might mean and what this might mean for decision making in all sorts of situations where the decision maker cares particularly about the person for whom the decision is being made. And we're writing up a paper at this very moment for an academic journal. So although I finished nearly 2 years ago, this feels very fresh, and it continues to be an important part of my life.
Thank you very much, Nick. Patricia, you mentioned a little bit about your dissertation before, which again was very different to both Jess's and Nick's, a crowdfunding piece. Do you want to say a little bit more about that, about your question and some of the key findings?
Yeah, sure. So I think I stumbled on the topic almost by accident. I was having two different conversations, one with an entrepreneur we support that was a relatively mature business, but said that they were launching a crowdfunding campaign, an equity-based crowdfunding campaign. And then the other was a friend who they'd had one successful crowdfunding campaign at the onset of their business. And now 3 years in, we're going for like a second round. And I was like, wow, that's painful. Why would you do that to yourselves? And I think for me, that just drew my curiosity. And as I talked to a few more people, actually realized that crowdfunding, especially investment-based crowdfunding, not the traditional GoFundMe, which is donation-based, but actually investment-based, where ventures go and seek either, crowd, from the crowd to buy into the venture, equity-based, or to provide other forms of investment vehicles, whether it's asset-backed loans, or essentially some other type of investment-based vehicle, was actually growing in Kenya. And but it was also still a very nascent field. And so through using, looking at this through institutional work as an emerging field, I then had to understand, how is this emerging field growing and seemingly growing rapidly, but also how is this being embedded, especially when investment-based crowdfunding has taken off in the West, both in in Europe or in the US because of supportive legislation, but none of that was really the case in Kenya. And so that conundrum, I think, essentially led me to look at this from the perspective of the institutional actors that were supporting this growth. And so my question was really, how do institutional actors use trust across multiple levels to embed crowdfunding in Kenya? And essentially, was welcomed into a community where I didn't really always have the lingo for. So a lot of background reading to just get up to speed around crowdfunding, but also really, qualitative interviews, in-depth interviews with key informants. And so I was able to take the perspectives, not just of intermediaries who are the crowdfunding platforms, but also entrepreneurs that had successfully raised funding. The regulator, so I had the opportunity to speak to the Capital Markets Authority in my country, as well as also an industry association. Again, all of this I had no idea existed. And so that was like, it was such a journey of discovery, but then really understanding how all of them And because emerging fields often are messy, the actors are not always aware of each other and do not always align in terms of motivation. So trying to understand, you're all doing this from different angles, but what's the commonality, which is really around trust, so figuring out, how do you use trust to build on existing social capital, one-on-one? How do you then, lengthen chains of trust to then draw in new groups? Because then for this industry to grow, it cannot just be that I talk to the people I know, but then essentially that, the people who are the actors that are trying to grow the field would draw in new types of investors. So in our case, it was people in the diaspora, chamas, which are informal investment-based groups. And then finally, how can institutional actors such as the regulator and industry association broker trust to be able to make people believe that investment-based crowdfunding is a viable vehicle and therefore grow the industry. And so I think for me, I think just being able to take what seemed to be a messy phenomenon and almost still very dynamic and use institutional work theory to try and understand and also provide recommendations for a pathway forward. And it's been interesting, for example, to see, independent of this work, but institutions such as the African Development Bank actually commit funding to grow investment-based crowdfunding across the continent, connect them to, ask them, I spoke to them maybe 2-3 months after I'd finished my dissertation. We were talking about my field, but then they said, oh yeah, we're interested in crowdfunding. I was like, oh, do you know the Africa Association for Crowdfunding? And they had no idea, but then somehow made the linkages. And now that industry association is collaborating with the African Development Bank to try and grow crowdfunding across the African continent. And so I think for me, just being able to say, first, for this particular sector or niche space, here is a pathway forward, but then also to reflect on the work that I do, which is global health innovation, which is still a nascent industry and in some senses has, characteristics of an emerging field, and to try and reflect on, how can what I learned around leveraging trust be used for my work, and be able, and how I, as one of the intermediaries, can then work with others to grow trust that then strengthens coalitions and builds, this sector. Yeah, that I think was my biggest takeaway so far.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Now, Simon, you, like Jess, focused on a question and a study that was around your own organisation, didn't you?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I looked at, my question was, how do homeless people make sense of interventions designed to help them? And so to tackle that question, initially I wanted to sleep rough for a period of time, but that had all kinds of ethical problems, and I wasn't allowed to do that. So I had great access, obviously, to lots of homeless people through my work. So I was able to approach a number of homeless people at varying stages of the journey, and essentially I followed them around for a day and just asked them questions. We chatted as we went around. We'd stop in cafes or on park benches and just have a chat and talk about, that was my interview essentially. Just kind of let the questions discover themselves to find out what I'd really just started by asking them to tell me their story, and that just opened up into a kind of world of information that I was able to answer the question from. But yeah, so I had 10 individuals that I spoke to multiple times. Started off by following them around kind of their normal day, and yeah, I suppose my main findings, I had a few key findings really. I think the first was around information and how people new to the streets don't have access to information in the way that the rest of society did. So it's like, where do they go? How do they know where to go? And so what we found was they were cut off from society. No one was talking to them, and that they only found out where to go through other homeless people, and that was either very positive in terms of if that homeless person had a positive experience of an intervention, they would encourage that newly homeless person into an intervention, or if they had a negative experience of that intervention, they would give a very negative opinion, and all kinds of rumours kind of cultivated in that information piece. So a newly homeless person is trying to figure out the world, trying to make sense of everything through this second-hand information. The second thing was this term that we came up with called sense blocking. So we found that the emotion of the streets was so extreme that many people would actively engage in something we called sense blocking, and that was about often through drugs or alcohol, which were freely available, but because the emotions were so extreme, they needed to block their senses and to not it was too much to think, how can I get out of homelessness? That was too big a leap. So they just looked for something that could just kind of get them through to stop that. So sense blocking was a big feature. And then lastly, we found that the relationship was so important, the community was so important, that those that were able to get out of homelessness were the ones that were able to build relationships outside of the homeless community and to make friendships outside of the homeless community. And in the study, that either came through faith. Through a faith group, people would find belonging, they'd find friendship, they'd find community outside of the homeless community, or it will come through a job. Similarly, that's kind of where they made their friends, that's where they found their purpose. And so it's either, and that's where people got out of homelessness. So that really fed into, well, this is a big piece of information. We need to make sure we're building people. Ending homelessness isn't about houses. Oh my gosh, it's about more than just sticking someone in a flat and getting them on methadone. It's about building them into community. It's about building relationships. And so how do we do that? How do we help homeless people find relationships outside of the homeless community? So that was that was a big take home.
That's great, thank you very much. Unmute yourself, Neil.
Yes, that was really fascinating as always, and I hope the audience of prospective students and hopefully some of our own current students found that really interesting and compelling. I mean, seeing your eyes shining still when you talk about your work is really fantastic. You know, you talked about how you applied, you know, fairly sophisticated ideas and theories to real-world practical examples. And all of you are working in new areas. And that's really important for us. I mean, the course is about, you know, critical knowledge through our teaching. It's about building community, which you have said already, but it's also about creating new knowledge. And all our students come from very different contexts and often have accesses to people and places that we don't. And that is really, really useful in building new knowledge around social innovation and obviously to practice as well. So thank you for joining us today. Again, for our guests, do look at our material online. Do look at our website. If you're interested in applying in 2020, we close on the 1st of June. But all is not lost. We open again for cohorts 6 in 2021. We open in September this year. But before I go, I want to say thank you to everybody. And I think everyone wants to know why Professor Tracey has time for a hangman on his wall. It's a compelling answer. Why have you got it on your wall, Professor Tracey?
Nothing else to do. The joys of homeschooling. Joys of homeschooling. You've got to have some entertainment.
I just thought we better clarify that for the audience. Anyway, thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time. Thanks again. Goodbye.